today.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I want to welcome you to Sabbath School this morning. And we are privileged to have Drs. Bull and Guy with us again this morning to talk about their book, God, Sky, and Land, talking about Genesis 1 as the original hearers heard it. I have found this very fascinating. And right before I turn this over to them, I want to share that if you haven't been to the website recently, the Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School website, it has changed. You can actually find the videos there rather than trying to find them in order on YouTube if you don't know the title of it, and you can also find the schedule there. So I'm going to turn the time over now to the two of you.
Let's pray. Loving God, on this special weekend for Christians everywhere, we can hardly express the depth of our gratitude for Jesus, for truth, for each other, for the Advent hope, for this opportunity to share and hopefully improve our understanding of your word. Grant us a sense of your presence as we think and talk and share and grow together. In the name of Jesus. Amen.
You might well ask, why should we dedicate an hour of our time on a Sabbath morning to two obscure Hebrew words that nobody actually ever sees when they read Genesis, and very few people, except some odd souls like ourselves, have ever paid any attention to? The reason that we think it's worth our while and yours is because these two words were crucial to the way Moshe understood his world. And they're not crucial to the way that Ian Michael understands his world, and therein lies all the difference. Now,
And the problem.
and the problem. You remember that we started out talking about the Genesis science conflict, and we've now ended up with two Hebrew words to pursue the Genesis science conflict, and an egg white bowl from my wife's kitchen, which has been commandeered to serve other purposes. But for those of you that are here for the first time, we are dealing with two characters in addition to ourselves. So there's four of us. The first is Moshe Heb. And Moshe is the ancient Hebrew, and we're attempting in our retro translation to read Genesis the way that Moshe would have read it. The way
Though he may well have heard it.
though Moshe probably couldn't read. We're guessing that more likely than not, he heard somebody else in the village read it, because his was an oral society and not a literate one in the sense that we use the term. We're this fellow, Ian Michael O'Durn, his initials, Ian Michael, when said rapidly with his surname, I'm O'Durn. Comes out as I'm modern, and we thought that was interesting enough that we have pursued it, even though we admit it's a little bit corny.
Can we groan again this morning?
You can groan, because we are coming up with an overarching importance of a dome. So we've got, yes, thank you. We've got these two characters here, and Moshe is the one that we are attempting to get into them. Well, it's Moshe's mind that we're attempting to get into with our retro translation. And of course, if we're going to retro translate, we've got to translate every single Hebrew word. And there's a couple, and we're going to talk about them today: the firmament and the deep, the rakia and the tehom, that we, Ian Michael, and us never actually see when we read Genesis. And as a consequence, what we think Genesis is about is, I guess, our sun, our moon, and the stars. I mean, it talks about the sun and the moon and the stars. We think Genesis is talking about our solar system. But we're guessing that Moshe didn't think that at all. Moshe thought it was talking about his world, which had a rakia. This nice line here is the rakia, and this sort of nondescript water here is the tehom. Now that's a completely different story, because inside of the rakia, actually stuck on the inside surface of the rakia, as far as Moshe was concerned, was the sun, the moon, and the stars.
And that made a whole lot of sense, because when you look up, you see the sun moving across what the dome-like appearance of the sky, and likewise the moon and the stars. So it was a perfectly reasonable understanding of the reality that one's eyes, well, as a reasonable understanding of the empirical evidence.
Yes, that's what his eyes told him. He looked up there, and Genesis, on day 4, the story tells us that God created the greater light and the lesser light, and set them in the firmament, the rakia. Now, they were set there by God, and they were set on the inside, because that's basically all that Moshe could ever see. And that's why this copper hemispherical dome isn't really much use. It's misleading. And it's misleading because we look at it and say, aha, that's the world of Genesis. It's sort of spherical, kind of like our Earth, and it must have existed somewhere, and deep space perhaps, and all they could see was the inside. The inside, by the way, is nice and blue, and unfortunately there's some stars and a moon stuck there, so there's a little bit of day 4 there. Day 3 is here, which you can't see, but we'll put it up there. This is day 3. This is the land and the vegetation, and eventually it's going to go in there, but for the moment we're dealing just with day 2. Now day 2 is an interesting day, because most of us can't even remember what God did on day 2.
That's because we don't know what God did. And it's hard to remember something you don't know.
And the reason we don't know is?
Because the word firmament is essentially meaningless. We don't, if you ask, if we took a poll here, or asked you all to, if we administered a quiz, we teachers are used to doing that, and said,
No, but this is Sabbath. The quizzes come on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday here.
Okay. But if we did have a quiz and ask each person to write down what was or is the firmament, we would get a strange conglomeration of answers. Because,
You think we'd get answers at all?
well, sure, because this is a very bright group and creative, and all creative and bright students know that if you don't know the answer, you guess. You
Okay.
put down something. I mean, the easiest way to get a 0 on a question.
Something is what the firmament is actually translated as in certain versions. It's translated as something, or space, or expanse,
Or horizon, or canopy. It's translated in a variety of different ways, and indeed, and maybe this is jumping ahead, but I did want to be sure not to forget to say that the difficulty that translators have had with the word rakia is illustrated by the fact that the word that is used in more translations than any other, though not the majority of translations. But the plurality goes to the word firmament, which is really curious because firmament is not related at all to the Hebrew word. It is a transliteration of a Latin word. And I think this reflects the frustration, the desperation, let us say, of the translators of almost all English versions until very recently. So they resorted, and that's a deliberate word here, resorted to appropriating a Latin word.
This probably has something to do with St. Jerome.
Well, yes, and the Vulgate and all of that. But it is not, the word firmament, the first thing we're saying, and I think that's in the handout somewhere, isn't it?
Yep.
That it is not a translation, it's a transliteration.
And in a transliteration, rather than translating it into English, what they've done is just simply put English, or we would say Roman characters, to make the equivalent of the Hebrew.
Yeah, it's substituting Roman characters for Hebrew characters, and then pretending
But they've done something useful.
that is helpful, that is meaningful.
Well, the word firmamentum in Latin does have meaning because it's a perfect good Latin word, and it means something strong and substantial on which something else can safely rest. It means steadfast, constant. It sometimes was used in Latin. Actually, it's still used in Latin occasionally to denote the main point of an argument. So when you come to the central point of an argument,
The firmamentum.
it's the firmamentum. And in Latin, the word does have meaning. In English, it does not. And translated into English, we have dealt. I mean, the only text I know of is the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Well,
Yeah, that's the other one that we all learned, in grade school, because we had reason to memorize Psalm 19:1, and that's the other place where we are aware of, even familiar with, it's part of our consciousness. But an interesting thing, since you mentioned that, Brian, is that in Genesis 1:6, where we have, and God created the firmament, or the rakia, I guess we should say.
God didn't speak Latin.
God didn't speak Latin, right. The question as to what language God does speak is...
Hebrew comes as close as any that we can deal with at the moment.
In Genesis, rakia is most often translated firmament in English translations. But in Psalm 19:1, the most common translation is sky, or skies, plural. And I think that reflects the difficulty, the obscurity, maybe the desperation of the translators, the uncertainty, that's a better word, the uncertainty of the translators. And now, the fact that they translated the same Hebrew word differently in different contexts isn't in itself a problem, but I think it is interesting that we have this difference, especially since the word itself seems to be quite obscure.
Well, the reason that we're dwelling upon rakia, translated as firmament, is, I think, aptly stated in the final sentence of the first paragraph. To the extent that Ian Michael senses a glimmer of meaning in the word, is pretty sure that whatever it meant never actually existed, even though it comes first in Moshe's list of God-created entities.
And that's a problem.
That is a serious problem.
You're implying, Brian, that the Bible is telling us something which is blatantly false. Now, you're a Christian, you believe in the Bible, etc. How can you expect us to swallow that?
That's why this is a team with a theologian and a scientist, and that's the problem for the theologian. Yes, as a
Okay.
scientist, I can tell you that what Moshe understood as the firmament, to science, probably doesn't exist, and probably, well, almost certainly never did. And that's why it's a problem, because we use the word firmament all the time when we're reading English translation. We don't know what it means, and if in fact we go back and look to see what it meant, it's something that doesn't exist. And that may have something to do with why science and Genesis are seen to be at odds.
And to muddy the water a little more, not a lot, but a little, I would suggest that the other word we're dealing with, tehom, translated the deep, isn't much better.
Oh, I think it's even more obscure.
Oh, okay,
The deep?
the deep,
Yeah.
though the noun in Hebrew, tehom, appears much more often in the Old Testament than rakia
Yes,
does.
it does.
So,
Okay, well, we've got the deep here. It's this sort of stuff. It's the pre-existing water, although it wasn't exactly water. It's the pre-existing water that was there when God began the creation process.
and that suggests a really
Right.
unorthodox, even heretical view, and that is that God did not begin the creation process
Ex nihilo.
ex nihilo, out of nothing, because there was something. Now, what the something was, we can argue about and do.
It was the deep.
It was the deep.
And it was the deep that Genesis, verse 2, says God's Spirit was hovering over. So whatever it was,
It was.
It was. Well, let's try to illustrate the deep. How about that?
Well, I give you a B+ for effort, but
Okay, so there was something there. It's described as water and darkness in Genesis verse 2, with God's Spirit hovering over it. And then what happened is that God created a rakia. He made a space in the whatever the deep was, and in that space he created a dome or a vault. Now, most of the newer translations will translate it as vault, which is, of course, what Moshe would have seen when he looked up. He could see the inside of this dome.
yeah, we are assuming that the general use of the words dome and vault are distinguished in this way. We're not claiming that everybody uses the words this way, but in general, if you think of this hemispherical structure, yes, here we go. If you look at it from the inside, from underneath, it appears, and we usually call that a dome. No, a vault.
A vault.
Sorry, got that exactly wrong. Yeah, we usually call that a vault, a vaulted ceiling of a cathedral or something. But if you look at it from the outside and from a distance, we call that a dome.
If you're looking down on the top,
Yes,
assuming it's horizontal.
yeah.
And that, of course, is something that Moshe could never have done. He had no idea what the other side of it looked like. Now, in later Old Testament times, Ezekiel uses the other side of it as a basis for God's throne. And there, the rakia is described as hard and made out of crystal. That was several hundred years after Genesis would have first been written down. And as near as we can tell, what Moshe would have thought about was primarily the inside. The sort of blue dome that he could see as the sun set and the stars started.
And that we all see.
And that we all see, except we often don't see it as a dome because we've seen the earth from outer space, and we know it's a sphere, and we know we're looking, we know there's nothing up there because we've seen rockets leave the earth and head into outer space, and they don't run into a rakia. So when we look up, I suppose a 6-year-old, 7-year-old child looking up at night as the sun sets and the blue dome darkens, probably would see it as a dome, or a vault, sorry.
But he would be disabused of that idea as soon as he started listening to his teachers in elementary school at least, talk about science, about the universe, about the solar system. I mean, you don't have to be a graduate student to have heard of the solar system. That's just part of what we grow up with. And that's one of the reasons why when we read Genesis,
We think of the solar system.
what we see in our minds is a solar system. I mean, it talks about the sun and the moon and the stars. That's the solar system, or at least the sun and the moon are part of the solar system, and the stars are the universe beyond that. And as we get older, we think of the Milky Way galaxy as our galaxy.
Our home galaxy.
Yeah, our own galaxy.
Yeah, so what Ian Michael is looking for in Genesis is an explanation of how the solar system came into existence.
Now, let me emphasize, what Ian Michael, us, is looking for,
Yes.
not what Moshe.
No. Moshe's expecting from Genesis a description of something else entirely, and it is so different to our minds that we very seldom tumble to what actually is being said. And so the deep is important because the deep was there when God began the creation process. At least that's what we're told in Genesis. And the deep was something that God had to contend with before the creation process could begin. And so that's what God was doing on day 2. The first thing, the first physical entity, God created light on day 1.
Yes.
But the first physical entity that God created was the rakia, the firmament. And that would obviously be necessary in order to push the tehom above and beneath. Now, the tehom was still there. It was there throughout the rest of Genesis. How do we know? Because it was the tehom that broke through the upper portion of the rakia and produced the flood. That's what Genesis tells us. We don't often worry too much about where the waters of the flood came from. Now, if we're going at it scientifically, we'll talk about aquifers and maybe a passing comet made of ice, or maybe a shell of water-rich something or other. But no, the Bible says that Tehom broke through the rakia at the time of the flood and flooded the earth. That was the cause of the flood. And of course, the Bible infers, though it doesn't so state, that that's where the water went back to when the great wind dealt with it. Now, you and I, knowing the hydrologic cycle, have a problem with that because we say wind cannot dry up water. All it does is move it around a bit, and sooner or later it's going to come back down as rain. Moshe, as near as we can tell, did not know anything about the hydrologic cycle.
Now, I want to explore a little bit a way to understand why the Bible contains what appears to be information, quasi-data, can we invent that term, that simply are incorrect, just wrong. I mean, we have just suggested that neither the Tehom nor the Rakia existed. They certainly don't exist now, and we are pretty sure that neither of them ever did exist now. Why does God say things that aren't true?
Well, while we're at it, can we say that Genesis is quite clear that the sun goes around the earth? And we're quite clear that the earth goes around the sun. So that's about as wrong as you can get in terms of the relationship between two bodies. To use a technical term, it's 180 degrees wrong.
Yes, Moshe wouldn't have.
No, Moshe wouldn't have appreciated
Appreciate
180 degrees.
But what I want to get at here, Brian, is that if God is going to communicate to human beings, any human beings, Moshe and us, God has to use the language that the human beings understand.
And the concepts with which they think.
Yes, because that is part of language. Too often we think of language simply as a bunch of words in a dictionary. But language also includes our concepts, our understandings, and
We think with words.
we think with words. That's one reason why encouraging, did we say this last week? Encouraging your grandchildren to develop vocabulary is a really good idea, because the richer one's vocabulary, the more, well, the richer can be one's understanding, one's thinking. Now, there are some things God can't do. If God wants to communicate with people in China, with not anybody who happens to be there, but with Chinese people, God has to use, and I mean has to, in a very explicit way, God has to use either Cantonese or Mandarin. God cannot communicate with Chinese people in Swahili or English. That's just the nature of humanity, which after all God did create. So to say that there are factual errors in Genesis, factual errors that seem to be attributed to God indeed, that is not necessarily a problem if we understand that God, well, understand two things. One is that God has to communicate to human beings in ways that the human beings can understand, can handle, can digest, to use that metaphor. And how we understand depends a great deal on our experience, individually and collectively. So God will, because God wants to communicate, God is willing to do what is necessary. Now, that may sound like too obvious a sentence to be verbalized, but God does, even if that is going to cause problems
later on.
later on. But God cared so much about Moshe. God wanted to communicate, I would say, the good news, the gospel, to Moshe in words that, and ideas, concepts that Moshe would understand. And so that's what God did. The fact that we think differently, so that Moshe's world is a strange world to us. In fact, a couple of generations ago, some neo-Orthodox came up with the phrase, the strange new world of the Bible. That is, the strange world we are now beginning to understand was Moshe's world. And it isn't our world, and of course, our problem, and we keep saying this is probably the third week in a row, that our temptation is to assume that the Bible was addressed to us. It is God's word to us, right? Yes. But it was not initially addressed to us. It was addressed to people who thought and spoke very differently.
And thought with very different concepts. We have here a totally unrealistic picture in which, even though they're separated by 3,000 years, Ian Michael is looking over Moshe's shoulder. But that's just to remind us.
It's a symbol.
It's a symbol.
Theologians love symbols, so.
And we've got Moshe here reading. Well, maybe he couldn't read, or maybe he just listened. But what Moshe is reading is this, and Ian Michael is puzzled, understandably so, because several of those things do not appear to be real. And how can the Bible describe something on day 2 of creation that we now believe doesn't exist? Well, we know it doesn't exist. We believe that it never did exist. And that's so. But throughout the Bible, the term firmament or rakia actually shows up when the Old Testament's translated into Greek, and Paul writing in that language, the word that was given, the translation that was given to firmamentum was stereoma. And that is what Paul describes as the firmness, the substantial nature, the constancy and the steadfastness that should characterize Christian faith. Colossians 2:5. You will see that's the same word as rakia. And it's very odd, therefore, because both the Greek and the Hebrew should come into English sometimes, in some versions, as expanse, which is the absolute opposite of something firm, something substantial, something upon which other things might safely rest. And so a legitimate question would be, how in the world, I'm not quite sure which world we're
Whose world?
Yeah, whose world here, but how in the world did rakia end up as expanse?
I don't know, but
It's losing that translation, by the way. Almost all of the translations done in the last 25 or 30 years have translated it, we think, much more appropriately as dome or vault. But for many, many years, firmamentum did get translated. Actually, the Pew Bible in the La Sierra University Church and the Loma Linda University Church until 2011 translated it as expanse. But they finally saw the light, so to speak, and the translators of that very popular version, they didn't make a big deal out of it. But if you'll look at the Pew Bible now, it's translated, I think, as vault, but it's either dome or vault.
it's vault.
It's vault. So how did expanse creep in here between firmamentum and vault?
My guess is, since I was not part of the process, I can only guess, but that rakia, in its etymology, in its meaning, comes from the Hebrew word rakech, which means, or meant, to beat out, or to stomp out, and beating out is a process which expands the metal.
It expands the surface area. The metal's still the same amount of metal.
Right, but it does expand the surface area. Now, unfortunately...
Let me add just a moment here. How many of you have been to the market in Beirut and watched the artisans there take a lump of brass and beat it into a plate. I brought back some plates because I was fascinated by the beating out of brass into a plate. But the Hebrew verb, rakah, was very common in the Old Testament. We've given you quite a few of the references here. And wherever it's used, it always meant something like beating out or stomping out or hammering. It was usually metal that it was being worked on. The brass plates that covered the altar were made from the censers of Nadab and Abihu. They were beaten out into brass. That's the Hebrew word. The same word is used to beat gold and silver into threads that were used to weave the sanctuary curtains.
But what is, I think, inexplicable, it's a nice sophisticated word, is the assumption that you can go from an expanded metal surface to the notion of expanse, which means essentially empty space.
Or atmospheric expanse, which is nearly the same thing until you know that there's gas there.
Yeah, so the translation of rakia as expanse seems to me to be just a mistake, an inaccurate use, not only an inaccurate understanding of rakia, but an inappropriate use of the idea of expanding, expansion, which then somehow becomes expanse. And that almost certainly couldn't have been part of the Hebrew mentality, because the Hebrews were not big on, in fact they were down on, what we would think of as abstractions. They were very concrete thinkers. And that's not bad, that's not a mistake, but the idea of...
So you think, as a Hebrew scholar, or as somebody who actually can read Hebrew, or could,
yes.
that's a very unlikely translation. Well, I see movement over here. Have we reached the end of our appointed time?
Well, at least for this aspect of it. By the way, when I was in Southern New England Conference, one of the pastors told us that the language of heaven was Italian. He said Italian's the language of music, and music is going to be the language of heaven. So
We're all going to be learning Italian.
well, that's what John Ferraro said. So, anyway, okay, at this time, we'll start entertaining questions, and so, okay. And by the way, last week I know I missed somebody that had his hand up for quite a while, and you can guarantee that we'll get you if you give us $100. So.
This morning I can identify with Moshe. I feel bug-eyed and perplexed, and much like he looks. But however, what you've done today I think is really important, and you just emphasize our dependency upon translation and transliteration. As I read through the ancient Semitic languages, trying to explain and understand what you're explaining, the Semitic nations and even the Hebrew can't agree upon the application of the use of the word rakir or raka. Your definitions, I think, are very standard. They are what I expected to read. But the interpretation, the application varies between Hebrew scholars, that at least that I read. For example, raka is correctly defined here as always beating out, stamping out underfoot, spreading out, beaten out. And the argument is that the earth wasn't beaten out, it wasn't hammered out. Rakia means the hammered bracelets. It gets back to the Milky Way. That's what God was saying was beaten out, was hammered out. And many Hebrew people, and certainly the Babylonians, record Raka as the hammered bracelet. you see, and you give the right definitions. I'm just pointing out, not that I'm right, I'm just pointing out the different interpretations or applications or assignments to that word. The definitions, I think, are both correct. But what I want to get to, and I think we have to think about, is I don't think about this as theology. I think about it as a very thumbnail sketch, a very economic, abbreviated thumbnail sketch that I consider history. I think theology for me starts at a later point, at the Sinai experience, where God says, now I'm going to tell you something really important. There's a theophany. He engages us. But I have Adventist friends, childhood friends, that will say, look, Rodney, if the creation story doesn't hold up as we were told it in children, in the Bible stories, if the 7-day literal translation doesn't hold up, I'm going to throw everything out. It just pulls the pin on everything. My point is, wait a minute, why would you do that? This is just history. It's not theology. That's how I rationalize it in my mind. But maybe it is theology to you folk.
Well, there's still a lot more to come. And yes, we do believe it is theology, but it's a theology that incorporated everything that God was understood to do. And in those days, and for Moshe, God was understood to do a great many things that we today would attribute to the outworking of scientific law, natural law. Now, since God did it, then it falls into a very broad tent of theology. But there's several more versions. We need to get a little bit further, and thank you for bringing it up.
Okay.
Yes, we are claiming that it is theology, but it's not theology the way the term is usually used.
And it's not the kind of theology, it is not the theology that is our theology.
Mm-hmm.
So and I'm not trying to be cute here, but it is a kind of historical theology, or in some places in the Hebrew canon, it is clearly theological history or theologized history. It's the author's theological interpretation of what happened back then. And the question, how accurate is that as history, is something that's very complicated.
More will be said on this topic. Yes.
Like usual, let me read a couple of quotes. God made the world. He was not dependent upon pre-existent matter. This is Ellen G. White. And you mentioned that Moshe didn't know about the hydraulics circle or system.
Hydrologic cycle.
Sister White said that he wrote the book of Job. In Job 36, in Spanish is so powerful to my mind, but let me read Psalm 35:7. He caused the vapors to ascend from the end of the earth. He made lightnings for the rain. He bringeth wind out of his treasures. If you read Job in Psalms, they understood. Because it said it, read it, and then you make your comment.
This is a commonly adduced text. Oh, let me first let Fritz deal with God was not indebted to pre-existing matter. Genesis says, that doesn't say that he was. But the idea of God not being indebted to pre-existing matter is not present anywhere in the Old Testament. Now, it shows up in the intertestamental period for the first time, and by the time of Christ, it was at least talked about. But this is theology. I'll just hold it here.
Oh, okay. I think we need to take seriously the word indebted. To say God was not indebted to pre-existing matter is not the same as saying God did not use pre-existing matter. And I think that's a distinction that is perhaps significant. That God, well, the whole process of creation is a process of divine freedom, divine initiative, divine accomplishment of something that could not and would not have otherwise been accomplished. So I don't see any necessary contradiction between saying God was not indebted, and I think that's the thrust of the Ellen White sentence to which you refer. I don't see a conflict between that and saying in the process of creation, God made use of something that already existed. At the same time, God produced that which that pre-existing something could not have produced on its own. Okay? So that we don't have a sense of some kind of spontaneous evolution going on here.
I want to apologize for digressing from this, but today is Passover, and people sit at the Seder table, and I think both of those guys would understand the experience very similarly of fleeing, of persecution, of death, and you have talked about words being described and they have a different understanding, but I think, at least today, and I'm sorry I'm not where you're at in this, but there are things that we understand the same. We understand the same.
Absolutely. And the reason, that's why, of course, the Bible is meaningful to us today. And that's why, even though it was not addressed to us, in a very real sense, it was intended for us. We just have to be careful that because it was not addressed to us, we make allowances for the fact that it was addressed to Moshe and his kin.
I had the chance to read your book when it first came out and attend the Sabbath school back then. And just seeing what you're doing now, it seems like this is something that you feel really passionate about because you're communicating the message and putting a lot of time and effort into it. And it's always really interesting to me to know like what motivates the message that someone wants to share. For me, like my burden to communicate creationism in general is really motivated by that I believe that the creationist worldview addresses the questions of human value and nonviolence in really profound ways that can't be addressed by an evolutionary worldview. So if I believe that I'm created and I'm valuable because I'm made in God's image and that every other person on the planet is too, that's going to have really serious implications for my sense of responsibility and how I treat them. And also, it just kind of lays the groundwork for nonviolence and the relief of human suffering. So when I think about just as a creationist, what do I want to share with people? That's kind of like, that's my burden. So I'm just curious, like, in your mind, this particular aspect of creation that you feel really a burden to communicate, like what are the implications of the way that ripples out, and like how does that connect to human suffering or a really practical sort of theology?
Thank you very much. We couldn't agree more with your statement about creation, and we share it. As we announced in the very first of these lectures, what we're dealing with here is a disconnect between science and Genesis. That's what we're passionate about, because we don't think that disconnect actually exists. And we think we can show that it doesn't exist by getting back to what Genesis was understood to mean by the people who first read it. But in terms of why we are creationists, you have phrased it much better than we could have done ourselves. Thank you.
By now, I think we can say that it is not very easy to explain the story of creation in Genesis, even in a retro translation. Though English language is relatively a rich language, it's the lingua franca of the world. And, at this moment in time, there are several languages that are borrowing from English. Neologisms are called this. Then I'm thinking how hard it will be for those that have poor languages to explain all this. And a question, when you started your research for the book, did you include in your research any creation myths, like the Babylonian, for example, myth of Enuma Elish, or other myths? And if you did include that, how it helped you to make your thesis for the book?
The answer to that one is no. We concentrated our efforts on Genesis, but obviously both Fritz and I have read those in times past. It was not part of what we undertook. And the reason we concentrated on Genesis was because we're concerned about the disconnect that exists between Genesis and science. A disconnect that has existed for 400 years, ever since science came to be generally accepted as a legitimate discipline. And science as a legitimate discipline rose along with the idea that there was nature and nature's laws, and that if you understood nature's laws, you might be able to control, to some extent, nature and predict what was about to happen. Well, the disconnect exists not between Babylonian myths and science. It exists between Genesis, chapters 1 through 11, and science. And so, in answer to your question, we concentrated on the story as told in Genesis.
I'd like to.
I have just a very simple question. Did you have some sense of where the pre-existing matter came from? Did God create that too, or is it just
No.
out of the ether?
If
Or
you're
is there any
asking-
indication in biblical language?
No, no. This is not something that Brian and I have discussed at length, but my answer is no. I have no idea where that pre-existing matter came from, except to say, to make the theological claim that all matter comes from God. God is the source of all reality. And, beyond that, when and how, I don't have a clue. Now, Brian, being a scientist, may have a clue.
This is a theological question. It's not a scientific one. You've heard the answer from the theologian.
I've been wondering what Moshe would think were he here this morning. And I think he would say, maybe you missed the whole point. And that I think Moshe would say, if you want to know what I meant, you need to do two things. You need to take seriously the literature with which I was disagreeing. And to say that one didn't even study that literature is a little bit amazing, because he was addressing that. That was the very thing he was doing. And so if we want to understand him, we have to understand what he was opposing. First point. Secondly, I think Moshe would say, if you want to know what I meant, you need to look at the text and see what I repeat. And what is the refrain that occurs again and again in Genesis 1? It is, and God saw, and it was good. Good, 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 all the way through, the whole thing. That seems to be the message. He seemed to be saying, evil is not an intrinsic part of the world. Evil is something that is an enemy, an intruder. But contrary, let's say, to Buddhism, in which suffering is thought to be permanent, pervasive, and irreducible. Genesis is saying, no, the world as such is a good place. And if there's evil, it's a distortion of that goodness. Now, wouldn't he say something like that?
I think not. Remember that what we're doing here is dealing with the original hearer's version, not the original writer's version. Now, what you had described, and described eloquently, and I think correctly, is undoubtedly the original writer's version, or at least part of it. We're interested in the original hearer's version. What did Moshe hear? And the reason that we're interested in that is because it was Moshe that had to decide that this is really good stuff, and I'm going to copy it. This is how we got the Bible. We got the Bible because Moshe and subsequent generations heard these stories, heard these accounts, found that they understood God more clearly as a result, and therefore sat down and copied them. Now, we actually, both of us have read all of the Assyrian and the Babylonian myths, creation myths, but the question was, what did we investigate to prepare this series? And the answer is Genesis. And the reason is we wanted to know what Moshe heard. The original hearer's version is a retro translation, trying to get inside of Moshe's mind because we think he was responsible for the Old Testament scripture being preserved. As far as we know, everything that was preserved and handed to the rabbis when the Old Testament canon was put together was incorporated into the canon. There was no winnowing at that point. But there was undoubtedly a lot of winnowing earlier because we know of all sorts of books that were cited in the Old Testament, but we don't have copies of them anymore. There is a chapter in our second book which lists, I think, 32 references to books that the Old Testament writers had, but we no longer have. And so, yeah, I agree entirely with what you said, but we're headed in a slightly different direction. We're through. We're done.
They will be back the next 2 weeks, so keep your questions. I wanted to say, though, you guys very well illustrated the point in that you said, well, they hammered it out and either increased the metal or something along that line, and he said, no, the metal, very literally, the metal did not increase. It's the same amount of metal. The surface area increased. So we have the two different minds and how they approached the concept. My daughter at age 8 needed an MRI. She said, Mommy, will there be shots? Healthcare background. No, no shots. Neglected to say there'd be an IV. When they put the IV in, she looked at me, you lied to me. Very, very different concepts and understandings, and those words, very important, very important.
Nice
So,
illustration.
let's have our benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.
Amen.